1943. The European sky no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. Once indisputable masters of the air, German pilots now looked up with unease. Up there, above the clouds, new silhouettes had appeared. They were called the Thunderbolt. At first, there were only rumors. A huge, heavy, ugly airplane made by the Americans. Pilots laughed. With such a monster, they won't even be able to take off, they said. But the laughter quickly turned to surprise. Kam aus der Sonne und verschwand wieder. He came out of the sun and vanished again. From Lieutenant Helmut Reimann's report, July 1943. In the early months of 1943, the Luftwaffe still felt confident. The Bf 109 and FB 190 were thought to be the pinnacle of engineering. Germany had experience, pilots, tactics, America, newcomers, and ambition. Soon, however, American squadrons flew ever deeper into Europe, and the bombing raids became ever more precise. First submarine pens in Brest were hit, then factories in Schweinfurt and Regensburg. With each raid, those new escort fighters appeared more often, bulky, shiny, with round fuselages and roaring engines. They looked like iron bores, one FW-190 pilot wrote. We thought they couldn't maneuver. We were wrong. Unlike the German planes, the Thunderbolt was not light or elegant. It was made by engineers, not artists. Thick wings, a huge Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine, almost 8 tons. And yet it flew. And not merely flew. It came home even when riddled with hundreds of bullet holes. In the summer of 1943, strange rumors began circulating among German units. American planes kept flying even with a crippled engine. Pilots reported seeing a Thunderbolt burning, yet still holding the sky. We hit it 6 times, but it didn't fall. It just turned and went away. From a report of JG2, Reichthofen, August 1943. For the Luftwaffe, this was new. German fighters were thin and fast, but their vulnerability was known. One burst and the fuselage would flare up like paper. Now they faced a plane that seemed built of steel. By autumn 1943, the situation had become alarming. The P-47 Thunderbolt escorted B-17 bombers farther and farther, from the English Channel to Hamburg itself. German interceptors could not approach the formation without risking running into a dense screen of fighters. The Thunderbolt wasn't fast, but it was always where it needed to be. At first, German pilots tried attacking from above, but the Thunderbolt could withstand a dive at speeds that made German planes lose control. Then they tried from below and ran into a withering fire of 8 heavy-caliber machine guns. At the Luftwaffe staff at Rechlin, reports were being compiled. Engineers demanded data. Which engine? What armor? Why does it not fall? But no one could answer. The aircraft was new, and its characteristics were kept secret by the Americans. The Thunderbolt is not a plane, it's a flying fortress. From a technical roundup at Rechlin, September 1943. The arrival of the new American fighter struck at the morale of German pilots. They no longer felt like hunters. Now, they were the prey. We no longer chose when to go into battle. The Thunderbolt chose for us. Pilot Walter Schroeder, Jagdgeschwader 26. Losses mounted. The Americans flew higher, farther, longer, and most important, they returned. While Germany struggled with shortages of aluminum and fuel, America produced P-47s by the thousands. Republic Aviation's factories ran around the clock. Germany made fighters by hand. America made them on assembly lines. And that conveyor was producing what would be called the most rugged fighter of the war. In the autumn of 1943, a thought sounded in the Luftwaffe staff that no one wanted to say aloud. If the Americans have learned to mass-produce such machines, we have lost the air war. But hope still remained. The Germans believed in their superior pilots, in close combat tactics, in a tradition of engineering artistry. Yet somewhere deep inside, everyone knew. A new opponent had appeared in the sky, one you could not underestimate. Thus began the story that would soon bring a German ace-face to face with that very monster. The airplane he was supposed to shoot down, he would first have to understand. Ich werde ihn fliegen und vielleicht verstehen, warum nicht stirbt. I will fly it, and perhaps understand why it does not die. He would write those words in his log before his first flight in a captured American P-47. While engines roared somewhere over France, at a Luftwaffe airfield, German engineers were already preparing a place for their first American guest. What followed would change their idea not only of war, but of the very notion of strength. Spring 1943. The air front over Western Europe is turning into chaos. American fighter squadrons, the 56th, the 78th, and the 4th, begin escorting the B-17 flying fortresses. German radars detect movement they are not used to. Northern routes, altitudes above 8,000 meters, speeds higher than most Bf-109 G6s, and somewhere among the clouds a new sound can be heard. The low guttural roar of the Pratt Whitney R-2800. War kein Vogel. War ein Tier. Oberleutnant Hans Held, Jagdgeschwader, 2. April 1943. Over France, a flight of Fu-190s attacks American bombers. From nowhere, a single silvery silhouette appears behind them and dives almost vertically. I thought it would break up, Held later recalled. But it passed through a cloud of fire, leveled off and climbed away. We couldn't believe such a lump would obey a pilot at all. Within weeks, German units already know the name of the new threat, the Thunderbolt. Pilots nicknamed it the Iron Elephant. They laughed until they tried to shoot one down. A Bf-109 fired at 100 meters. Bullets tore through the fuselage, but the P-47 kept flying. A punctured radiator didn't mean death. The air-cooled engine could limp the plane back to base. We saw it smoking and still get away upward. From a Jagdgeschwader 26 report, May 1943. The Thunderbolt turned out to be heavy, and that weight became its advantage. In a dive it reached 885 km/h, while the F-190 lost control already at 780. German pilots for the first time faced an enemy they could not chase, either up or down. Fällt wie ein Stein, aber fliegt wie ein Adler. It falls like a stone, but flies like an eagle. 12 May 1943. A flight of 3 P-47s intercepts Bf-109s near Caen. In a short engagement, 2 German machines are shot down. The third flees with a hold radiator. The Luftwaffe command demands explanations. Pilots answer, "We didn't see where they came from. They dived from height and vanished." Intercepted German chatter from that period is one of the rare records of their confusion. Achtung, Thunderbolts, nicht steigen, tauchen sofort. Attention, Thunderbolts, don't climb, dive immediately. The phrase nicht steigen became a sort of meme among the Allies. It meant even the Luftwaffe no longer controlled altitude. Germans were used to a hit to the fuel tank, Gärnde instant fire. But the Thunderbolt had self-sealing tanks, an armored cockpit, and a thick aluminum skin. It forgave mistakes. It returned when other planes stayed in French fields. We patched them up and sent them back. Mechanic, 56th Fighter Group. To German pilots, it felt like an injustice of nature. By June 1943, German intelligence had gathered first technical data: weight 8 tons, speed 690 km/h, ceiling 12,000 meters. OKL, Luftwaffe High Command, thought these figures wrong. Such a plane cannot maneuver, analysts wrote. But the numbers held up. The Thunderbolt was ungainly, but its durability broke all the calculations of aerial combat. Germans began to change tactics, attack only with altitude advantage, avoid prolonged dogfights, strike briefly and get away. A pilot of JG-11 wrote in his diary, "Now we do not seek engagement, we look for a chance to escape." Even the enemy admitted. The Thunderbolt was not graceful, but it inspired respect. German pilots began to treat it as an opponent rather than as a target. Ich hasse ihn, aber ich respektiere ihn. I hate it, but I respect it. By summer 1943, the Technical Center at Rechlin requested that if a P-47 were captured intact, it be delivered for testing. Engineers wanted to understand how it withstood such stresses and hits. Ein amerikanisches Rätsel, an American riddle. A few months later, that wish would be granted. Month after month, German pilots met more Thunderbolts. They escorted bombers over Hamburg, Rouen, Brest. Their fire cut the air like a knife. They came out of the clouds. We fired. They did not fall. At Luftwaffe headquarters, a thought began to take shape. If you can't destroy the beast, you must tame it. In autumn 1943, one American Thunderbolt will be forced down on German soil. And then the legend from the sky will become a reality in a hangar. There, on the concrete at Rechlin, a German pilot will touch the enemy's metal skin for the first time. And the story that will change the Luftwaffe's understanding of the war will begin. July 1944. The sky over France is on fire. The Americans push forward after the Normandy landings, and German fighters do everything they can to slow their columns. The weather that day was perfect. Blue sky, light wind, and squadrons of Thunderbolts once again escorting the bombers. German pilots took off to intercept, and one of them, Oberleutnant Hermann Roth, remembered. "We saw them back over the channel. They came like hammers of silver." But one of those hammers would not return home that day. Its fate was something neither pilot suspected: to become the most valuable captured aircraft of the war. At 7,000 meters, Second Lieutenant Jonathan Miller of the 56th Fighter Group engaged an FW-190. A shell hit the wing, flame licked the tank, and the instrument panel flashed blind with light. He managed to turn the airplane away from the front, trying to reach the channel. The engine coughed, died, and the P-47 went down. Miller belly landed it in a field near Reims. When the smoke cleared, German soldiers were already closing in on the downed aircraft. Villagers watched as soldiers surrounded the damaged plane. An officer with a pistol shouted, "Nicht anfassen, amerikanische Maschine." Do not touch, American machine. Half an hour later, a truck arrived with engineers. They inspected the fuselage and exchanged surprised looks. Most of it was intact. The undercarriage torn out, a wing damaged, but the engine had survived. "Es ist ein Wunder," one technician said. "It's a miracle." The airplane was carefully dismantled, loaded onto a trailer, and sent to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's main research center. Rechlin Airfield was the heart of German testing. Prototypes flew there. Everything from the Me-262 to the V-1 was evaluated there. Now, among German machines, an American stood on the tarmac, huge, with dull silver skin, still smelling of petrol and cordite. Sieht roh aus, wie ein Hammer. He looks raw, like a hammer. Engineers walked around it. The first impression, massive, clumsy. But the more they looked, the clearer it became. This was not clumsiness, but calculation. Under inspection, they found 12 millimeters of armor around the cockpit, a duplicated hydraulic system and unusual reinforcements at fuselage joints. German engineer Kurt Hirsch wrote, "This machine is built not for speed, but to survive. Every part is designed for repair and resilience." It seemed the Americans built aircraft assuming they would be repaired in the field, not in the hangar. On the table before the engineers, they unpacked 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, heavy, simple, reliable. Unlike the German MG 151s, they required no fine tuning. Too simple to break, one technician noted. Ammunition load, 300-400 rounds. That meant a Thunderbolt could fight longer than any Luftwaffe fighter. They opened the cowling. Before them sat a giant Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp. The engine weighed nearly a ton. To the Germans, it looked like madness. "Such an engine should tip the airplane," one said. But calculations showed the opposite. Thrust compensated for weight, and air cooling made the engine less vulnerable to bullet holes. "He can fly on half his cylinders," Hirsch marveled. The Rechlin Commission logged first conclusions. The Thunderbolt is too heavy, too thirsty, but too survivable. The chief engineer at Rechlin added, "We cannot afford to build planes like this." They can. That was an admission louder than any artillery. In the archives remains a note from an anonymous observer. "The Americans fight like industrialists. We, like artists. Their machines are ugly but eternal. Ours are beautiful, but die." That line traveled through the decades and became a definition of the difference between two worlds. 3 days after the P-47's arrival at Rechlin, an ace officer arrived, Captain Wolfgang Bührer. Behind him, 200 combat sorties, the Iron Cross with oak leaves. He was given an impossible task, to fly the American plane. "Ich will wissen, warum nicht stirbt. I want to know why it does not die." Bührer accepted, but with a smile added, "Wenn mich tötet, dann hat gewonnen. If it kills me, then it has earned a victory." Engineers studied the cockpit for weeks. All instruments were in English. Someone had translated them with a marker on the glass. The control layout impressed with its simplicity. Everything thought out for quick reaction. The Americans had designed the airplane for the average pilot, not for an ace. For Germans, raised on fine tuning, it was a revelation. Any of their pilots can sit and fly. Ours must be taught. The evening before the test flight, Bührer wrote in his log, "I feel no hatred, only curiosity. If this aircraft is truly so good, perhaps we are not fighting pilots, but the idea that man is becoming unnecessary." That entry later became one of the most quoted lines in the German war archives. At dawn the next day, the German ace would walk onto the runway, climb into the American beast's cockpit, and start the engine whose roar reminded the sky that even enemies can admire one another. Dawn. Rechlin Airfield, August 1944. Fog still lies over the runway and trucks roar in the distance. On the tarmac between the Focke-Wulfs and the Me-262 prototypes stands a stranger, silver, massive, with an American star covered in grey paint. Engineers whisper. Soldiers stop to look. And before it stands a man assigned the impossible task, to take off in the enemy's machine and return alive. "Ich fliege nicht für Propaganda, ich fliege für Wissen." I don't fly for propaganda, I fly for knowledge. Wolfgang Bühler, Diary, August 5th, 1944. For 3 weeks, Luftwaffe engineers adapted the American aircraft to their systems. They translated the instruments, replaced the radio, checked the hydraulics. Bühler came every day, sat in the cockpit, and studied the controls. His first impression was unexpected. Alles ist logisch. Everything is logical. Where German planes demanded coordination of both hands and feet, the American pilot operated intuitively. Every button, every lever, within natural reach. August 6th, 07:10. Bueller climbs into the cockpit. Around him, dozens of engineers and officers. A camera stands to the left, recording every move. He pulls the throttle, and within seconds, the airfield trembles under the roar of the Pratt Whitney R-2800. Ich fühlte es im Brustkorb. I felt it in my chest. The engine roared like a living creature, a dense, low sound, unlike any German motor. It didn't shriek. It rumbled, like the ground before a storm. The engineers exchanged glances, vibration almost absent, RPMs steady. The engine held its power perfectly. Bueller advanced the throttle. The plane began to move. Slowly, like a heavy beast, it gathered speed, and then, against all expectations, lifted off with astonishing ease. Ich erwartete Widerstand. Antwortete mit Sanftheit. I expected resistance. It answered with gentleness. At 300 meters, he retracted the gear, and for the first time in 200 sorties, he felt like he was flying a machine that wanted to live. The P-47 handled perfectly. Heavy in appearance, it was astonishingly stable. Smooth turns, soft control response, and an engine that didn't lose thrust at altitude. Ist kein Kämpfer, ist ein Fels mit Flügeln. It's not a fighter, it's a rock with wings. At 600 km/h, the aircraft felt like it was swimming through thick air. Bueller noted, ideal for long-range escort. The fuel tanks were huge, the consumption moderate. He tried to force the plane into German-style maneuvers, sharp turns, climbs, but the P-47 wasn't made for that. It lost speed in a turn, but immediately regained energy in a dive. It doesn't maneuver, it falls, and no one can catch it. He tested a dive at 700 km/h, where the Bf-109 shuddered and lost control. The Thunderbolt flew straight as on rails. Ich verstand, warum unsere sterben. I understood why ours are dying. After 40 minutes in the air, Bueller returned. Landing was perfect. The engine didn't choke. The gear came down smoothly. He stepped out of the cockpit, and everyone around knew something had changed. Lächelte nicht. He didn't smile. From the memoirs of engineer Kurt Hirsch. Bueller removed his helmet, took his notebook, and quietly said, "Now I understand why we're losing." That same day he wrote, "The Thunderbolt surpasses our planes in stability, simplicity, and structural strength. Its engine is a miracle of mass production. It doesn't need an ace, it needs fuel." He noted, stability in dives up to 885 km/h, absence of dangerous vibration, incredible structural durability, ease of control at any speed. 2 days later, the report landed on General Gallen's desk. He read it for a long time, then said, "If the Americans can build such machines by the thousands, our war is over." But orders from above were clear. Continue testing, find weaknesses, disassemble the engine, weapons, and armor. Bueller continued flying the P-47 for another week. In his diary, he wrote, "I feel like a traitor, but this machine demands respect for the enemy. It was built not to kill, but to come home." He simulated damage, shut down a cylinder, lowered oil pressure, and still, the plane held steady. Will nicht sterben. It doesn't want to die. When the test ended, Bueller was invited to the hangar where officers and technicians waited. They asked him, "How does it fly?" He answered, "As if the Americans built it not with engineers, but with factories." Silence. That phrase became legend among German engineers. After these tests, the Luftwaffe changed its design philosophy, now focusing on durability and standardization. But it was too late. American industry had already achieved what Germany could no longer match in resources or time. Ich flog den Feind, und flog besser als wir. I flew the enemy, and he flew better than we did. A month later, Bühler would take off again, this time in a Me-262. He would die in October 1944, never seeing the end of the war. The plane he flew would survive the war and be found by the Allies in the same hangar. On its fuselage, under a layer of dust, they would find an inscription scratched in German. Hat mich gelehrt zu fliegen. He taught me to fly. Rechlin, September 1944. The hangar smells of kerosene and oil. On the concrete floor stands a dismantled Thunderbolt, without wings, without a propeller, but every part neatly laid out in boxes, tagged in both German and English. On the wall hangs a sign, Zerlegen und verstehen, disassemble and understand. It was an order from the Luftwaffe headquarters. Every screw, every hose, every wire had to be studied. Chief Engineer Kurt Hirsch oversaw the process. He had already seen dozens of captured aircraft, Spitfires, Mosquitoes, even a Mustang. But this one was different. Ist kein Kunstwerk. Ist eine Maschine zum Überleben. It's not a work of art. It's a machine built to survive. The first thing that surprised the Germans was the number of standardized parts, nuts, bolts, fittings, all the same size, allowing replacements without adjustment. For Germany, where nearly every part was made for a specific model, this was unthinkable. The Germans realized the Thunderbolt wasn't the result of a genius engineer, but of a system. They don't design airplanes, they design production. Hirsch's notes. Every assembly could be put together quickly and replaced even faster. At Republic Aviation, mechanics could install an engine in just 20 minutes. In German factories, that took hours. The P-47's fuselage astonished them with its metal thickness. Where German planes had 1.5mm skin, the Thunderbolt had nearly 3 meters. It's not an airplane, it's a flying safe. Yet the weight distribution was perfect. The center of gravity moved closer to the cockpit, making the aircraft stable even with wing damage. The Germans ran an experiment, simulated holes in the wings and tail. The machine still withstood takeoff loads. The biggest surprise was the wiring. The Americans used color-coded connectors. Each cable had clear markings, making assembly virtually foolproof. Ist idiotensicher. It's idiot-proof, noted one technician with a smirk. But behind that smirk was admiration. The American philosophy was simple. Even a minimally trained soldier should be able to repair a plane in the field. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 was dismantled at last. The engineers expected a marvel of technology. Instead, they found a marvel of practicality. Air cooling eliminated the vulnerability of a radiator. Each cylinder was a separate module, replaceable without removing the entire engine. If one dies, the rest live, wrote Hirsch. Where German engines required hours of precise tuning, the American motor ran as long as it was fed fuel. Hirsch made a comparison table. Parameter FW190 P-47. Engine weight 980 kg 40 km. Max speed 670 kW at 690 km range. 800 km 600 km engine. Repair time 6H 1.5. Wiring complexity high minimal. They won not with speed, but with time. The engineers noted the cockpit's comfort, a wide canopy, panoramic visibility, and ergonomics designed for long flights. The German pilot feels like a hunter, the American like an operator. Every instrument was labeled, every gauge readable under any light. Its simplicity allowed even an exhausted pilot to fly effectively. During the analysis, intelligence reports arrived. American factories were producing 400 Thunderbolts a month. In Germany, at most 60 fighters of any model. Sie kämpfen mit Maschinen, wir kämpfen mit Händen. They fight with machines, we fight with hands. For the first time, the Germans realized they were losing not because of mistakes, but because of their very way of waging war. Many Rechlin specialists would later admit studying the P-47 changed their entire understanding of engineering. Some of them would work in the US after the war, at Boeing and Republic, passing on their knowledge to former enemies. Wir haben verloren, aber wir haben gelernt. We lost, but we learned. After the analysis, it was decided to adopt several American principles, standardize parts, simplify repairs, implement unified mountings. But time had run out. The front was moving toward Berlin. One engineer wrote in his notebook, "We study the enemy and begin to understand that he surpasses us, not in hatred, but in the ability to work together." That thought, simple and bitter, became the essence of the engineering shock of 1944. On the final day of the report, the Rechlin engineers photographed the dismantled Thunderbolt. It lay on the floor like an anatomical textbook of war. Hirsch said quietly, "Es ist nicht schön, aber es ist vollkommen." It's not beautiful, but it's perfect. Rechlin, October 1944. Rain drums against the hangar roof. On the tables lie stacks of papers, diagrams, and charts. On the covers, the title reads, Vergleichsanalyse, P-47, Thunderbolt vs. F-190, Me-109. Comparative analysis, P-47 vs. F-190 and Me-109. The Luftwaffe engineers no longer argue. They already know that the reports they are writing will not change the course of the war, but they will change the understanding of why Germany is losing it. The tables begin dryly. Only facts, no politics. Parameter F-190A8, BF-109G6, P-47D, the Thunderbolt speed at sea level, 560 km/h, 545 km/h. Speed at 9,000 landers, 635 km/h, 40 km/h, 85 ITC. Time to climb 6,000 and total 7.2 min 6.10 in weight, min 5.9 min weight, 421 T, 313 T, 7.9 T. Ammunition load, 500 rounds, 503 400 range, 800 km, 660 km, done ground 600 km. Average repair time, 6H 5.5, H 1.5. H return probability after damage, 27%, 33%, 78% beneath the table. One phrase, kein Kommentar, no comment. The Germans carried out more than 20 test flights in the P-47, comparing its behavior to their own aircraft. Above 7,000 meters, the Thunderbolt retained control and thrust, while the WW2 engines lost power. Fliegt dort, wo unsere Motoren atmen sterben. It flies where our engines die trying to breathe. Against headwinds, during descents, the American machine showed a stability none of the engineers expected. The most impressive test was the dive trial. The Germans had always prided themselves on their fighters' dive speeds, but the P-47 was in a class of its own. From 10,000 meters, Bühler, before his death, dived to 885 km/h, and the plane never lost control. Meanwhile, German aircraft broke apart at 820 km/h. Fällt, aber nicht stirbt. It falls, but does not die. For the first time, the Germans faced an aircraft whose aerodynamics and structural strength allowed it not just to survive a fall, but to use it as a weapon. At the test range, engineers fired at the P-47's cockpit armor with MG-151 machine guns and 20 Miniature cannons. The results stunned everyone. Half the hits failed to penetrate. Der Pilot bleibt leben. The pilot stays alive. The armored seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and steel cockpit frame made the Thunderbolt nearly invulnerable in situations where a German plane would burn in seconds. One engineer, Otto Klein, remarked, "Wir bauen Rennwagen, Sie bauen Traktoren, die Rennen gewinnen. We build race cars. They build tractors that win races. That summed it up perfectly. The Germans chased speed. The Americans built for endurance. And the war proved that victory belongs not to the fastest, but to the one who comes home. The reports emphasized that Thunderbolt production was entirely mechanized. Each section of the plane had markings and standard fittings. If damaged, a pylon or tail could be replaced within 3 hours. Das ist kein Handwerk, das ist Industrie. This is not craftsmanship, this is industry. Those words would later symbolize the end of the German century in engineering. The Germans calculated one P-47 cost about as much as 2 Bf-109s, but its service life was 3 times longer. The war had become arithmetic. America could afford to lose 50 aircraft a day, and by morning build 50 more. Germany could not. Ihr Reichtum ist ihre Rüstung. Their wealth is their weapon. In November 1944, the final report was sent to the Reich Aviation Ministry. Alongside the numbers, it contained philosophical conclusions. The Americans design not airplanes, but systems. Systems in which the pilot is only one link in the chain. That is why they are invincible in the sky. One officer scribbled in the margin, Vielleicht ist das die Zukunft. Maschinen, die keinen Helden brauchen. Perhaps this is the future. Machines that need no hero. According to legend, Hermann Göring personally reviewed the report. His reaction became a running joke in the staff offices. If I told Hitler that we're being defeated by a bolt with wings, he'd have me shot first. But behind the joke lay a grim realization. Everything they saw as the enemy's weakness, mass, simplicity, roughness, had turned out to be his strength. The engineers at Rechlin admitted that the Thunderbolt had become more than just a captured trophy. It was a revelation. Ist ein Lehrbuch der Zukunft. It's a textbook of the future. The Americans had proven that reliability was not the absence of failure, but the ability to keep working after failure occurs. For many German specialists, studying the P-47 became a personal crisis. They saw that German engineering was losing not because of bad ideas, but because it was too elitist. We build for aces, they build for everyone. The final page of the report contained one line. Wenn der Krieg verloren ist, dann nicht im Himmel, sondern in der Fabrik. If the war is lost, it is not lost in the sky, but in the factory. When the last report was signed, the engineers packed the papers into the archive and stepped outside. The evening wind swept dry leaves across the runway. On the tarmac stood the same P-47, now disassembled, its frame exposed, bullet holes visible. Kurt Hirsch looked at it and said, "This is not an airplane, it's a philosophy. And we lost to a philosophy, not to a war." Berlin, November 1944. In the conference hall of the Luftwaffe High Command, silence. On the wall hangs a map of Europe, crowded with red and blue pins. Almost all of France is already in Allied hands. Over the Rhine, American aircraft dominate the skies, day and night. Before the gathered officers lie folders stamped P-47 Evaluation, RLM Technisches Amt. Wir können ihn nicht überholen, also müssen wir anders fliegen. We can't surpass it, so we must fly differently. General Adolf Galland. The war had forced the abandonment of old dogmas. No longer could they rely on close combat, where an ace decided the outcome of a fight. Against the P-47 and P-51 Mustang, such duels became suicide. Instead of hunting, German pilots were now ordered to act briefly and coldly, attack from above, fire a burst, disengage, no turning dogfights. Die Zeit des Duells ist vorbei. The era of aerial duels is over. Directive Number 7, issued in December 1944, became one of the most unusual documents in Luftwaffe history. For the first time, it acknowledged the enemy's technological superiority. Excerpt from the section Air Combat Against the Thunderbolt. Avoid prolonged maneuvers. Do not attempt to turn fight horizontally. The Thunderbolt retains energy longer than the FW-190. Use cloud cover, altitude, and surprise. It was almost an admission of defeat, but the Germans still hoped that brains could outmatch factories. Pilots who once saw themselves as heroic hunters struggled to accept the new reality. They no longer felt like aces, but cogs in a defensive machine. Früher jagten wir, jetzt fliegen wir zum Überleben. We used to hunt, now we fly to survive. Pilot Joachim Weiss, JG-11. In early 1945, a special school opened in Wittmundhafen, where pilots were taught the new hit-and-run tactics. Training was conducted on FW-190Ds and the rare Me-262s. Each trainee received a translated copy of the American report on the P-47's performance. On the classroom wall hung the slogan, Verstehen heißt Überleben. Understanding means survival. The study of the Thunderbolt inspired new projects. Messerschmitt engineers revised the Me-109K's concept, and Kurt Tank, creator of the FW-190, proposed strengthening cockpit and wing armor. Wenn wir schon verlieren, dann sollen sie uns schwer töten. If we are to fall, let it be hard for them to kill us. But it was all too late. None of the improved prototypes reached the front in significant numbers. At Rechlin, comparative test flights continued. An FW-190D and the captured P-47 took off side by side. Results were recorded with stopwatches. The Thunderbolt required a longer runway but climbed faster. In a dive, it outpaced the FW-190 by nearly 100 km/h. In turns, it lost, but always retained energy. It's heavy, but it doesn't tire. Test pilot Hans Peters' report. The Luftflotte West Command adopted a new strategy: lightning strikes by small groups on Allied airfields. Their goal: destroy the Thunderbolts on the ground, where their armor was useless. Operation Bodenplatte, January 1st, 1945, was the final hope. But instead of a breakthrough came disaster. Over 300 German aircraft destroyed, veteran pilots killed. We burned our future in one day. By spring 1945, Galland wrote in his diary, "The Americans win the air with quantity and reliability. We have spirit, but spirit cannot replace gasoline and aluminum." The Luftwaffe had become a shadow of itself. Pilots took off in crippled planes, engineers repaired them with no spare parts. For many aces, the war lost its meaning. The heroes of duels and personal glory now fought against faceless machines, products of American assembly lines. Es gibt keine Ehre gegen Fabriken. There is no honor against factories. At a February 1945 briefing, a training officer gave a speech that would later be quoted in textbooks. "Each of you may be better than an American pilot, but their planes don't depend on pilots. They depend on the system, and the system is their strength." It was the recognition of a new world, one where wars were won, not by heroes, but by organizations. By March 1945, Germany had completely lost control of the skies. American P-47s and P-51s struck railways, bridges, convoys, hundreds of sorties each day, and every hour, new losses. The officers who had analyzed the Thunderbolt understood that everything they had warned about had come true. Wir haben gesehen, wie der Himmel verloren ging. We watched the sky slip away. Some young pilots still believed that the jet-powered Me-262 could turn the tide, but there wasn't enough fuel for even 1 in 3 missions. The Thunderbolt, once designed as an escort fighter, had become a ground attacker and a symbol of invincible industrial might. At one of the last briefings before the capitulation, a pilot said, "Wir haben alles getan, was wir konnten, aber sie haben das, was wir nie hatten. Zeit. We did everything we could, but they had what we never had." Time. Winter, 1944. The front is collapsing. Fuel is running out. But the Luftwaffe is still flying. In the skies, hundreds of American aircraft, and among them, the heavy, indestructible Thunderbolts. In the JG-11 headquarters in Kassel, a worn notebook lies on a table. On the cover, written in pencil, Bühler, Flugtagebuch. Bühler, Flight Diary. It is the final personal record of a German ace who had flown both the Me-109 and the P-47. The diary, found after the war, became not just one man's confession, but that of an entire generation of pilots. The first entry is dated September 12, 1944. Ich fliege heute den Feind. Ist besser gebaut, als ich erwartet habe. Ich fühle mich sicher in ihm. Zu sicher. Today I fly the enemy. He's built better than I expected. I feel safe inside him. Too safe. Bühler wrote not as a soldier, but as an engineer, a man fascinated by the system he was supposed to hate. He understood that this was not just an airplane, but the product of a nation where manufacturing was an extension of science. In another entry, he admits, "Ich habe keine Angst vor den Amerikanern. Ich habe Angst vor ihren Fabriken. I am not afraid of the Americans. I am afraid of their factories." He notes how each day the sky thickens. Where once dozens of planes flew, now there are hundreds. And the Thunderbolt, almost mockingly, returns from missions again and again, riddled with holes, yet alive. In November 1944, Bühler records a conversation with himself. Was fühlst du, wenn du ihn siehst? What do you feel when you see it? Need. Envy. He realized he saw in the enemy not just a threat, but an ideal of engineering perfection, a machine that forgives mistakes, that saves its pilot, instead of demanding the impossible from him. Many Luftwaffe pilots, like Bühler, had been raised on the ideals of the Knights of the Sky, duel, honor, precision, pride. But the war of 1944 had swept all that away. Der Himmel ist nicht mehr blau, ist aus Stahl. The sky is no longer blue, it's made of steel. Now everything was decided by numbers, altitude, speed, quantity. The Thunderbolt embodied a new era, an era where machines were stronger than men. The archives preserve other confessions as well. Oberleutnant Heinz Rügge wrote, "Ich sah, wie ein Thunderbolt Feuer fing und doch weiterflog. Ich wusste, dass ich beuma. Und ich verstand, sie bauen, zu leben. I saw a Thunderbolt catch fire and still keep flying. I knew I would have died, and I understood. They build to live." That simple phrase later appeared in collections of Luftwaffe memoirs. Post-war psychologists called this phenomenon the defeated professionals complex. Luftwaffe pilots watched their best friends die, while American pilots returned, even when their planes were half destroyed. Fiel nicht, weil nie an den Tod glaubte. It did not fall, because it never believed in death. Some pilots tried to justify themselves. They wrote that the Thunderbolt had no soul, that it was just a machine without honor. But deep down, they knew. That was precisely its strength. Wir fliegen mit Stolz, sie fliegen mit Sinn. We fly with pride, they fly with purpose. On October 15th, 1944, Bühler took off in a Me-262. His jet was shot down over Münster. When the Allies found the wreckage, the notebook was still in the cockpit. On the last page was a short entry. Ich habe ihn geflogen. War stärker als mein Hass. I flew it. It was stronger than my hatred. The Americans who studied his diary were astonished. Their reports mention for the first time a German pilot who respected the Thunderbolt more than his own aircraft. A copy of the diary is preserved today at the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton. It is used in courses on engineering ethics and psychological warfare. Many surviving German pilots, in interviews during the 1950s, said the same thing. Wir verloren nicht gegen Menschen, wir verloren gegen Ideen. We didn't lose to men, we lost to ideas. For them, the Thunderbolt became the symbol of a new reality, a world where there was no concept of honor, only efficiency, endurance, and numbers. An old pilot said decades later, Ich hasste den Klang seiner Motoren, weil klang wie Zukunft. I hated the sound of its engines because it sounded like the future. When the war ended, of all the machines that had flown over Germany, it was the rumble of the P-47 that remained longest in memory. For some, the sound of defeat, for others, a lesson. Flog nicht für den Krieg, flog für das Wissen. It did not fly for war, it flew for knowledge. February 1945. On Allied airfields, thousands of planes. Every day, engines roar above Germany. But this is no longer just war. It is total domination of the skies. In the air, the P-47 Thunderbolt. The same aircraft that once sat as a captured trophy in a Rechlin hangar has returned, and returned as a storm. Thunderbolt hat den Himmel erobert. The Thunderbolt has conquered the sky. From a Luftwaffe report, March 1945. American armies crossed the Rhine. Every bridge, every road, every train is under fire. The sky trembles from the thunder of engines. The Thunderbolts are diving to strike. They fly in waves, groups of 12, 24, even 48 aircraft. Hundreds of tons of bombs, thousands of shells. No German fighter can rise to stop them. Das war kein Kampf mehr. Es war Ernte. It was no longer a battle. It was a harvest. Luftwaffe pilot Walter Kaiser. Originally built as a fighter, the P-47 had become the perfect attack machine. Below, German convoys. Above, thunder itself. Shells rip through rail lines, trains explode, bridges collapse. Every sortie is no longer an attack. It's the final dismantling of the Reich's economy. They wouldn't let us move, even at night. Memoir of a German supply officer. The Thunderbolt wasn't fast, nor elegant like the Mustang, but it became the symbol of overwhelming force. It could carry a ton of bombs, tear through tank armor and trucks, and return to base with half a wing missing. Kam immer zurück. It always came back. German soldiers called it der brüllende Tod, the roaring death. Its sound was recognized from miles away. When the roar approached, even hardened veterans dove for cover. Wir hassten seinen Klang. Es war der Klang unserer Niederlage. We hated its sound. It was the sound of our defeat. By spring 1945, the Luftwaffe no longer existed as a force. No fuel, no spare parts, only teenage pilots. On the runways, charred Me-109s stood silent, while Thunderbolt squadrons roared above them. Wir sahen sie fliegen und wussten, dass der Krieg vorbei war. We saw them fly and knew the war was over. Amid the ruins of German cities, civilians looked up and saw silver shadows in the sunlight. They were no longer enemy planes, but the new masters of the sky. Sei flogen als gehörte ihnen die Welt. They flew as if the world belonged to them. The Thunderbolt became a symbol of the end and the beginning of a new age, where victory was determined not by courage, but by logistics. On April 8, 1945, over Leipzig, a group of remaining FW-190s, led by Oberleutnant Hein, clashed with 6 P-47s. The battle lasted only 3 minutes. 4 German fighters were shot down, 2 dove away. The Americans returned without losses. Der Himmel gehörte ihnen. The sky belonged to them. After the war, American pilots said the Thunderbolt was not the most beautiful, but it was the most faithful airplane. He looked like a milk jug, but he fought like a bull. Pilot, 9th Air Force. They called it Jug, the Jug, and that jug became the vessel of victory. In one of the final Luftwaffe reports, April 1945, a line reads, Keine Angriffe möglich. Thunderbolts überall. No attacks possible. Thunderbolts everywhere. It wasn't a statistic. It was an epitaph. When the Allies reached Berlin, the Thunderbolt no longer fought duels. It was a weapon of cleansing, burning depots, stations, railways. The city crumbled not just from artillery, but from the sky itself. Every engine's roar reminded us that resistance no longer made sense. In May 1945, the Thunderbolt flew its final missions. Now it patrolled the skies over defeated Germany, guarding Allied convoys and POW camps. On its fuselage, the scars of hundreds of battles. But it still flew. Kehrte zurück, das zu bewachen, was zerstört hatte. It returned to guard what it had destroyed. Above the ruins of Europe, the last thunder rolled. The Thunderbolt passed over Berlin, and its shadow fell upon the nation that once believed the sky belonged only to it. Kam als Feind, aber brachte das Ende. It came as an enemy, but it brought the end. May 1945. Germany has surrendered. The sky, once an arena of duels, has fallen silent. On the airfields stand abandoned aircraft, Me-109s, FW-190s, and among them a few captured Thunderbolts. Dust is being wiped from their wings, instruments removed, and for the first time after the war, engineers from both sides look at these machines together, without hatred, only respect. War der Lärm des Endes, aber auch der Anfang einer neuen Welt. He was the noise of the end, but also the beginning of a new world. After the war, the Allies invited German engineers to research centers in the US and Britain. Many specialists from Rechlin found themselves at Wright Field and Eglin Air Base. There, under the American flag, they saw the same aircraft again, not as the enemy, but as a teacher. Wir studierten den Feind, und am Ende studierten wir die Zukunft. We studied the enemy, and in the end, we studied the future. The engineers realized the Thunderbolt marked a turning point, not just in the war, but in the entire philosophy of 20th century aviation. It proved that reliability matters more than speed. Mass production matters more than uniqueness. Ease of maintenance is a strategic weapon. War der erste demokratische Jäger. He was the first democratic fighter. Kurt Hirsch, German engineer, 1947. After the war, the American companies Republic and North American took the principles of the P-47 as the foundation for the next generation of fighters. The philosophy, fly, fight, return, became the doctrine of NATO aviation. In every new model, the F-84, the F-86 Sabre, echoed the spirit of the Thunderbolt. He was the thunder that did not fade, but turned into the sound of the jet age. Among those who studied the Thunderbolt after the war were former Luftwaffe engineers. Some went to work for American corporations, others taught at the Technical University of Munich, all admitted one thing. He showed us that a machine can be more honest than a man, and the American pilots, returning home from the war, wrote in their memoirs, "The Jug never let me down, not once." For the Allies, the P-47 became more than an airplane. It became the embodiment of a philosophy, reliable, powerful, and built by the thousands. It represented the industrial strength of democracy, the idea that wars are won not by heroism, but by organization. He was the factory's answer to fascism. Life magazine, July 1946. When the German war memoirs began to be published in the 1950s, the word Thunderbolt appeared again and again, but now without contempt. One pilot wrote, "Ich hasste ihn, aber war gerecht." I hated him, but he was just. For German veterans, the Thunderbolt became not merely a symbol of defeat, but a lesson that technology can be more truthful than ideology. Today, Thunderbolts stand in museums across the world, in Dayton, in London, in Munich. Next to them are plaques not listing victories, but statistics of reliability, range, survivability. And under each one reads the same phrase, "The plane that always came home." Modern aerospace engineers say that the Thunderbolt was the ancestor of reliability. Every attack aircraft, every transport plane carries its DNA. War das Gegenteil von Schönheit, aber war Wahrheit. He was the opposite of beauty, but he was truth. The P-47 was not built for duels. It was built not to die. And that became the deepest philosophy of war. Victory belongs not to those who shoot better, but to those who endure. War keine Waffe. War Überleben in Metall. He was not a weapon. He was survival in metal. In 1965, 20 years after the war, former Luftwaffe pilot Walter Kaiser wrote to an American veteran, "Ich erinnere mich an den Tag, als ich ihn zum ersten Mal sah. Ich wusste, dass Himmel nicht mehr uns gehörte, aber ich war froh, dass priнадлежал to Kim, wie will." I remember the day I first saw him. I knew the sky was no longer ours, but I was glad it belonged to men like you. Across old European airfields, pieces of P-47s are still being found. Metal fragments, nameplates, sometimes whole fuselages. They do not rust. They still shine under the sun, as if the machine refuses to die, just as it did in those years when it was called Thunderbolt. He was born of steel, lived in fire, and died only when the sky became peaceful.